Oh yeah. Hello everyone. Thank you all for coming out to the 2021 series of How Do We Go Forward, How Do We Go Back? My name is Fen Kennedy, my pronouns are they and them, and I am speaking to you from the stolen land of the Creek Nation, now known as Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Every week I invite two guests to have a conversation with each other about topics of returning to academia or dance around COVID-19 and racial justice. Today we have Mark and Juliet who are going to be talking about social dance partnering and gender, which I'm really very excited about. Juliet McMains is a professor in the Department of Dance at the University of Washington, where she writes, researches, and makes art about social dance practices and their theatrical expression, with particular emphasis on Latin American and Afro-diasporic traditions in the United States. She is the author of Glamour Addiction Inside the American Ballroom Dance Industry, Spinning Mambo into Salsa, Caribbean Dance and Global Commerce, as well as numerous journal publications. Mark Carpenter is a dancer, DJ, teacher, and organizer focusing largely on the fusion scene and its emerging forms and conventions. He has helped organize many national and international Lindy, blues, and fusion events, Seattle Fusion Festival, Bluesquake, Northwest Recess, Bay Area Microfusion, Mile High Fusion, and many others. In collaboration with other leading dancers, he co-founded the blues proto-fusion weekly venue Drop Dead Blues, ran SLO Lindy Exchange, and the simple yet exquisite fusion of jazzy blues and groovy Lindy in the form of All That Jazz. Since 2019, he has co-run the emotionally focused, community-driven Fireside Fusion with Parker Null. Mark, Juliet, thank you. I know you have topics you want to jump in on, so I am just going to let you go.
Thank you so much, Fen, for inviting us. And I just want to say that I'm joining everyone from the traditional lands of the Duwamish and the Coast Salish people in Seattle. And listening to your bio, Micah, I realized, Mark, I start off with the wrong name. It's so good. I was thinking, it's really helpful to think about that most of my career in social dance has been in ballroom, salsa, and tango. So we're coming from, I'm coming from traditions that are holding on much more tightly to the gendered histories of the forms in the contemporary practice than you are. So we were just, I know when we were talking earlier, we were wondering how much the communities that we're coming from and the people here are familiar with or like attached to these gendered histories in the current practice. Because I teach at a university setting, so I teach young students, and they're already on board with like, let's blow up the patriarchy and let's all redefine gender. And but when I teach in the community and I go out into the community, especially in salsa and tango, the majority of the practice is really gendered, and everyone is assuming what role people are going to dance based on their perceived gender. And so I think that's really different from the scenes that you're coming from, Mark, right?
Yeah, I think that's important to note right off the bat that the fusion scene has done a pretty good job with doing a lot of that kind of gender. There's still work to be done, but I think they were largely inspired. Well, they're inspired from a bunch of different places, but the Lindy scene, the blues scene, and the fusion scene are all the ones that I spend a lot of my time in, and all three of those scenes have done work in that regard to all in their various ways to kind of to focus on the teaching and the social aspect of it. And I think maybe that's where we start. So I'll ask you the kind of like pointed question to get us going, Juliet. How much do you think we need to even still justify some notion of ungendered dancing where it comes to teaching, or ungendered dancing when it comes to competitions? Like, how much of that do you feel like you still have to justify outside of your like little bubble of academia in the South?
Yeah. And I'm not sure ungendered is the word I would use, because I feel like people still are interested in gender, but I like the frame of like open role, where it's like everyone is training in both roles. And I know there's some questions in some communities like queer tango, there's like even a debate like, does everyone have to do both roles? Isn't it about people getting to choose which role they want to do? I feel like in class settings, people are often pretty open to doing both roles, but it's then when they go out into the dance and that I can't tell you how many times I've been out salsa and tango dancing when um, everybody on the floor is looking like a heteronormative couple. And then there's so much social pressure to conform to that. If you're like, well, I really want to lead tonight, but wow, who's going to dance with me? So the reason that I've come to like really teaching all of my beginner classes with this emphasis on we're all going to do both roles. There's this historical gendered component, but that's not how we're doing it today. And here we go. And then we just move forward, is because I think the only way forward is to start the beginners that way.
Yeah.
But it's a long haul, like to then integrate this new generation into the community. I feel like fusion is so far ahead in that, partly because it's a young community, right? And you don't have the, like in tango and salsa, there's these like people in their 70s and 80s who are dancing in these gendered roles, and they're probably not going to shift at this point in their lives to start to do a different role.
How common is the phrase "Would you like to lead or follow" in those communities? Like when starting a dance with someone, right? Like, hey, would you like to dance? Yes. Would you like to lead or follow?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't happen.
Right.
It happens in my classes.
I think that's like one of the key places, right, to start is just make that the cultural norm. And this was an idea that was popularized by Mary Christensen on the East Coast. 5, 6, I don't even know how many years ago. She wrote an article, "The Revolution Will Be Polite," or something like this, that kind of detailed a bunch of different things, but like really laid down this groundwork of this is how we're going to change the communities and just normalize this practice. And it is, right, super normalized, at least on the fusion scene here on the West Coast. Every dance has this back and forth. Hi, would you like to dance? Lead, follow. Lead, follow, or switch, right, is usually the way that we hear it over in fusion. But the principle is the same. Like that simple, like, oh wait, there is a choice in this manner, right? Like slowly starts to seep through the community. I think that's kind of like the one biggest change that can happen to any community.
Yeah. I would love that to become a thing in salsa and tango, for example. And I'm hopeful, but not super hopeful that the reopening up after the pandemic is an opportunity for things to shift, because I'm thinking people actually are going to ask, well, how comfortable are you with touch? Are you dancing with other people today? Because people are not comfortable with the things they used to be comfortable with. So this is the time to introduce new questions to into the community. But I certainly haven't seen that. Like where I've seen the most success in tango, for example, is in a specific venue where the venue is set up. Like Catherine McDonald here in Seattle ran a practica that was for beginners night. And so it was geared for beginners, but people picked a name tag when they walked in that said they were beginner or volunteer. And it's had lead, follower, switch and their level, right? Beginner or volunteer on it. And that sort of calling it out with the name tag was so welcoming to the beginners that it became like a really amazing venue for the community. And I took that idea and started implementing it in my classes before I had everyone do both roles. So I had buttons that I had people wear. And then, because that was really an issue that I was having in my classes with non-binary students in particular, who were feeling like people were making assumptions about what role they wanted to do based on their perceived gender. But I've moved away from that now because now I require everyone to do both roles. And
Let's talk about that.
yeah.
That seems like that seems like an interesting component of like, okay, you have open roles. At what point do you require people to do both roles? At one point, does that become more optional, right? Like, I'm curious where your line is. I have like my own rules that I.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Well, I used to do it in the beginner classes. I would let students choose,
Mhm.
and then I require in the intermediate classes. And now I've flipped on that. I think the key is start from the beginning, because once you already have a comfort with one role, it's very hard to go back and be a beginner again. So the and the and in Tango, I actually found that the students learned faster learning both roles because they actually felt the weight from both points of view. In Salsa, they actually learned a little slower learning both roles in the beginning because there was so much to wrap their bodies around, but then they caught up and then they learned faster by the end of 10 weeks. So at the end of 10 weeks, they'd learned more and more solidly than a mono role class.
Yeah.
So I'm convinced as beginners, I mean, I'm almost convinced that just classes should be studying. Like in like ballet class, you do the left and the right side. Even if you don't like the left side, you got to train it. And then if you do a choreography, you can pick your favorite side. So then maybe when you're out social dancing, people can pick.
I'm going to jump in for a second and just ask, like, Mark, we've been talking a lot about beginners and salsa and tango and communities that are starting on this journey. Mark, can you maybe tell folks a bit about where Fusion is at and what you're doing and how you want to take that forward also?
Yeah, well, I think there's going to be some variance depending on which Fusion community you're in, right? Naturally, and I am in my own little bubble here in the West Coast, in particular in the San Francisco scene, where there's just so much Fusion. We do it in a particular way. In Fusion, it's normalized to ask if you want to lead follow switch. There's still assumptions that people make based on perceived gender or whatnot, but that is far less than going into, like, if I go to a tango night or even I would say a swing night. There's just like far fewer assumptions. I would like to see in the Fusion community, I'd like to see that grow even more, even without the help of pins or buttons, to like have people just be able to have those conversations, or even be able to have the conversations non-verbally to like negotiate lead and follow at the beginning of dances or whatnot. I'd also like to see, just in like as the skill improves of Fusion in general, being able to get people who are both skilled at leading and at following, right? And being able to like translate that into really, really skilled switch dances, and really be able to, push themselves in that way. Which brings us back to like where do we, or what do we expect in our classes? And I agree with you, Juliet. The way that I do it for mine is requiring beginning students to learn both roles, like this dual role, and then as the classes like increase in skill, expecting people to come in and choosing a role, and that role could be to learn both roles, right? Depending on what they're interested in. Because I do think that specialization and choice, right, is something that people are allowed to have, and they're allowed to only want to follow for a dance or for a night or for their whole lives, right? Like that is a choice that people are allowed to have, just not in my beginning classes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference because the Fusion community already has this normalized, and a community that doesn't. There have to be some incentives set up to make that transition. And that, like, what I'm thinking is in a specific space. So whether it's my classroom that I have control over, or this is an event, what I wanted to do before the pandemic was organize open role salsa night, where the goal is everyone is coming thinking everyone's going to ask at the beginning of every dance, what role do you want to do now? So that somebody who's like really experienced at leading is going to be like feel comfortable being a clumsy follower because they haven't practiced, where if it's like a regular night, like that's like, whoa, that's gonna like damage my reputation. So that's like, what do you think of that? How successful do you think we can be with those sorts of intentional spaces?
I mean, yeah, my answer to that is kind of my answer to organizing in general. You find the behaviors you want and you make them cool, right? Like, if you want it to be cool, or if you want people to do this thing, make all the people they look up to on board with that and excited, and like normalize that at the top of this pyramid, right? And then that will normalize it for everyone. If you've got the teacher of the class you just took, right, or the tanguero who you look up to is going around asking other men to dance, right, or like is following out on the dance floor, you're like, oh, wait, 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 like that starts to normalize this in your brain in a way that all of the new people doing something that not everybody else doing, that's not going to be nearly as effective. So I think the incentives, you're right, you're going to need some sort of incentives, and that incentive needs to come from the people that people look up to.
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible in those scenes, right? Where
well, it certainly was happening for a while in the Seattle tango scene, in that, and it was sort of a result of well, actually, I don't know, but like a lot of the advanced women were dancing with each other. And so that made it more and more comfortable. And then for other women or female presenting dancers to dance together. And then the men suddenly had less partners because the women were all dancing with each other. So then they started to think, okay, well, maybe we can dance together. So it was sort of this like tipping point when there were enough incentives aligned to sort of tip things. So it started to become more normalized. But then things shifted and it sort of rolled backwards. And I don't actually know why.
Well, that's actually a particularly interesting example in tango. From what I understand of the origins of tango as it came back to Argentina with men dancing with men, can you refresh my memory of that kind of? Well, how much of that is like an urban legend and how much of that is actually true?
It seems to be pretty true from all accounts because of the gender imbalance in Buenos Aires at the time, because the government was subsidizing immigration from Europe because there was not enough population to work, so that there were all of these young men coming over without their wives and sisters. And so some estimates were like 10 men to every one woman, some estimates are 4 to 1. So the men were dancing together because there were not women for them to dance with. So that's how the dance started. And these practicas that started out with all men dancing together just seemed like, now those may be the lure of that sounds ideal, right? That they dance in the woman's role is what it was called for like 9 months. And then they finally start learning the other role.
But it does have this sense of, if my goal is to be impressive as a dancer, like wouldn't I want to practice like feeling the other side of that dance, right? Like that's the only way that I'll understand how the things that I'm doing are felt, and that just makes sense to me.
But that's because you've got the incentives aligned. Like if the advanced men who only lead have the least incentive to learn anything new. They have, their pick of dance partners. There's always young people who follow, who are coming in that are eager to dance with an experienced dancer. They can show them how it's done. Right. So really shifting the incentives so that it's cool and that suddenly you're not cool if you only do one role is the challenge that I am trying to sort out. And, I'm tackling it from changing the young generation coming up and by trying to create spaces like an event or a practica where there's a different norm. But I also love the idea of getting more advanced dancers to, go out together and do this thing. So it's cool.
Yeah, I think thinking about like in the top level male leads in salsa or really any scene, it'll be I can see how the incentives would be hard, or like it'd be a tough pill to swallow to suddenly be a beginning follow. Or I mean, you wouldn't be a beginning follow at that point, but you'd be far less skilled or impressive perhaps.
Well, and I think we're sort of, there's a couple of big things that we're like not addressing, and one is like the ethnic and racial makeup of the community.
Sure. Yeah,
it's correct me if I'm wrong, but fusion is pretty white.
Yeah,
and so there's like kind of a different conception of gender and gender roles in white liberal scenes than in like salsa is a lot of Latinos and Latinx people, which is not to say that Latinx people are not gender fluid or queer, because there's so many queer, but it's just more complicated, I think, when there's so many different cultural codes crashing up against each other in the spaces.
Right, and what I was going to say is that high level salsa male lead, right? It's not even, they don't even need to follow, isn't the like most powerful thing they can do. I think the most powerful thing they could do is to go up to beginning male follow and ask them to dance. Like I think that is where the like that is the single like most important act of getting your really skilled male lead to invite the less skilled male follows to dance. Like that is the missing of this. Yeah.
And if I think about like when Eli Torres was here in Seattle, like I could have been 10 years ago by now, who is just a stunning follower. And I actually don't use that word in my classes anymore. I use interpreter. Just stunning in this role, like probably one of the best in the world. And every advanced male salsero came out and wanted to dance with him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, there's a certain point at which people's like love of the dancing overpowers whatever gendered prejudice or fear they have. And maybe that's like a key to tap into, like get the best friggin' dancers here. And at some point, everyone wants to dance with the best dancers, no matter who they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for like that wisdom about like how to create these spaces that are more, like I like to call them open role, you're calling them gender neutral?
Yeah, I think open role is probably the word that I would use. I mean, working from both ends of that pyramid, getting your teachers, getting the really skilled hotshots on board, and then teaching every single person who comes through the door a different cultural norm, and then eventually you'll kind of change the hearts and minds, as it were, of everyone. Asking people, right, like that whole conversation, asking people is going to be like a big step in that, right? Just normalizing that. I think another piece that we've like been skirting around, another piece is, right, just not being tolerant of homophobia, right, when it shows up in the scene. And there is a thin line between I don't want to dance with another man because I don't want to dance with another man, and I don't want to dance with like and being outright like homophobic or like dangerous in those spaces. And so being able to, I don't know, bring the same kind of awareness you bring to the consent of the women in the space, like being able to just stamp out that from all sides, from all different genders. So that's another piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's a lot of talk, like the Me Too movement raised a lot of awareness about sexual assault and sexual harassment on the dance floor. And I think that we can maybe, and there's a lot of like energy around that. And maybe we can also link like homophobia and to that, like there's sexual harassment and there's also like making people feel uncomfortable or unwelcome, or making people feel welcome. Like, how can we
Right.
welcome everyone into the scene?
This is a topic I want to like plunge more into, but I'm also aware that we're just about at welcoming our guests back for Q&A. And so I'm just going to ask, like, what are the thoughts that you want to make sure that you get out? What is the question that you wish you'd been asked on this subject before we take questions from people?
The super nerdy and semantic topic that is dear to me when it comes to open role, dual role. It's just like the definition of all those terms. And so I want to like quickly share the way that I use those words. And we touched on this last time, Juliet, you and I talked, but the open role in my classes, open role means that you can choose which role, right? But it could be either, and that could be doing both roles. Dual role implies requiring one that you do both roles, right? In the thing that it will take both, and then switch as like does double duty in the community and in our scenes, that it is either an identity that's either saying I can do both or I do both, though you choose, you know, whichever you do. But it also could be the act of switching within a dance, which is a whole skill set and like activity in and of itself. That there's overlap there, but I you know, it's important to me that at least I say that once during this conversation.
Cool. And I think maybe one thing I would say is that there is a really vibrant, at least online, intellectual discourse, and in some cities before the pandemic, physical practice of queer tango and queer tango spaces. And there's some queer salsa spaces, and I think those spaces are really important. At least they continue to be because of all of the homophobia that still exists in the world. And I actually think that I'm interested in addition to these queer spaces, having these open role spaces where people can do dual role or switch, and where that's encouraged, where it's not explicitly linked to sexual identity, just so that it welcomes more people in it. It makes it not just about being queer, but it's all of these other things. Not that it ever was just about being queer, but it just seems like we need all of these things to coexist in order to move forward into the world I'd like to see. And I have a lot more to say, but I know Fen's dying to let people back in.
Well, I know that so many people have things to say. I'm getting messages in the chat, like, when is it Q&A time? So I'll put folks out of their misery. Anyone who is listening, I invite you now, you may turn your camera back on. Please unmute selectively. Maybe because there are a lot of us, drop your name in the chat if you have a question that you want to share. But as people are coming back, I'm going to use host privilege, and I'm going to get a question in before people start. And I'm going to say, like, I heard about space change and social change, and something that I explored with my own scene was policy-based change. And in our hiring contract for teachers, we said we expect both members of a teaching partnership to speak to both roles as people who are fluent in that role. And so when we hired teachers, we could say, this is our contract, this is what we expect, we are like a gender-friendly scene. And having expectations of the people who come in that they would use like lead and follow and not men and women, that they would like offer people opportunities to choose their role. So have either of you experimented or do you have feelings about policy-based changes as well as social changes?
I think those are great. I teach primarily by myself, so I'm always speaking to both roles. And I usually have a student assistant of different presenting genders, so kind of doing that already. But I mean, I feel like in tango, for example, the touring tango teachers, 90% of them are male female couples where the man does all the talking to both roles and the woman stands there. And so we got to change that first. I mean, I feel like there's just so much work to be done around gender equity in tango and salsa. So, yeah.
But yeah, I'll agree. I think policy changes from organizers is actually like incentivizing it from the organizing point of view is also a great way to do that. Yeah, nothing really to add to that.
All right. In which case, let me open the floor to questions. And I see, I'm going to ask people again to drop your name in the chat if you have something that you want to ask. I know I have questions already on stack from Daniel, Sarah, and Lexi. So let's go in that order.
Yeah, sure. So one question that I had was, Mark talked about how in fusion circles, the standard question is like, do you want to dance, lead, follow, switch, right? Which I do think that it's maybe not as universal as we would like. I think that frequently assumptions are still made. But the other thing I was going to say is like, I know that in other dance styles, that's not as much like the verbal communication. You don't even ask, do you want to dance, right? Like there's different ways of doing that. So I was wondering if in those dance styles, maybe the key is not to add a verbal component that people are going to resist because they don't use verbal components, but instead find a way to fit like, basically when they're speaking a different vernacular for communicating, shouldn't we try to fit that vernacular for however we introduce this concept?
I completely agree. And as a non-tango, like I've done tango, but I'm not like super proficient in it. And again, I think a lot of the key is the male leads. Like in that style, it's the leads who are asking the followers to dance typically, but there are still things that you can do as a follower to like make yourself ready for that. Like I remember a particular time when I was in Berlin at a queer tango festival, right? And I wanted to follow. I would post myself at the edge of the floor, forward and open, like, and men would, or leaders of all forms, so mostly men would walk by and cabeceo me to ask me to dance, right? And so yeah, I agree. We can use the vernacular of the style, but it still requires men taking that step to ask other men to dance, which I think is like a lot of the friction that we're still gonna run into.
Yeah, the norm in tango, even when we're crossing, perceived gender boundaries, is that whoever invites the person to dance with the cabeceo, the head nod, is the one who's going to initiate or lead. Although in queer tango, most scenes, like in Argentina, where I spent a lot of time in queer tango, the standard is, because you dance 4 songs with one person, the norm is after the first song, ask, would you like to switch roles? So people do, like, part of the vernacular is you chat, not before the first song, but in between. So there's the time to discuss. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Beautiful. Thank you. Sarah and Samantha, I see you.
So my question, I'm trying to make it less broad in scope, but on the topic of trying to normalize different roles for different genders, I imagine there's different challenges in trying to normalize it for men or for women or for other genders. And specifically, I was wondering if both of you could speak to unique challenges for getting men to switch or for women to switch. And as an example, I struggle in certain Latin dance spaces dancing switch with women because of the mix of sexual harassment and homophobia, to the point where I just no longer engage in those spaces because it's that entrenched. And I have not experienced that, for example, at fusion spaces in dancing switch with women. And I know there's so many layers of this coming out in different dance cultures, and I wanted to hear more more thoughts on that.
Sarah, thanks so much for that. When I started really engaging in conversation with community around these issues in a public way, I organized an event called like Envisioning a Feminist Salsa. And I wanted to talk about dual role salsa and empowering more people to change roles. And what everyone who showed up wanted to talk about was sexual harassment and making the spaces safe for women, especially. And so I think that may be the root, because I think they're actually completely intertwined. So people are already on board with recognizing, men and women, that sexual harassment is an issue. Everybody I know in salsa has a friend who's really experienced assault or harassment on the dance floor, and they want to shift it. So I've been working with my students to come up with ideas like, what do we say at the beginning of the dance? Like, they really liked last week, they were like, wow, what if every time you ask someone to dance, you said, if there's anything that I do that makes this dance uncomfortable, can you let me know? What if we normalize that? And so maybe if we start by normalizing those conversations, that can also introduce, and oh, by the way, I'd like to lead the next song. It's such a challenging topic. Do you have any more thoughts, Mark?
Well, yeah, I mean, speaking for the men in the scene that I've seen, I think it comes back again to homophobia and the discomfort, and we can dig down and figure out what like fear and shame and whatever is underneath that, but it really comes down to, I think, if there are people in the scene that are men or male presenting or whatever, that make it unsafe for men to follow, for other women to lead, like, that is just a problem. And as an organizer, I think it's important as an organizer that a lot of times organizers get into the same problem people in like theater get. Like, they need butts in the seat. They need people in the door, and they make decisions that be like, well, I can't like lose this clientele because I'll not be able to afford to run a venue. And I think that's a line that you have, a stance you have to take, and just say, no, we just don't. If a guy comes into your beginning class and just refuses to dance with the men in the rotation, right? Either ask them to leave or make it really uncomfortable for them to have that position, right? I think that's not directly answering the question, Sarah, but that's I think the difficulty that I see with men in particular. Yeah.
I wanted to jump in for a second and talk about non-binary people. Because as like traditionally men tracks to lead or woman tracks to follow, like people who are not men and women tend to track to switch. And it can mean also that your gender presentation, if it is more fragile than a cis binary gender might be, is dependent on which role you take. And so if you are someone whose gender is not necessarily assumed correctly, one of the ways you can make people more likely to assume your gender correctly is to dance the role that looks wrong for you. But when we're talking about consent and we're talking about choice, if a non-binary person wants to just follow, but the pressure is not just about their choice and their role, but it's also the assumption of people around them and how people are going to address them and what people are going to think about the validity of their gender. So adding to this idea about incentives for men and women, thinking about incentives to a community to remember that there are non-binary people in the community.
So, Fen, do you think that if everyone were doing both roles, that there would be more space for someone who's presenting their gender, who identifies in one, for someone who like to choose any role and not feel like they have to choose a role that's matching some gender identity or perceived gender identity? Would that help solve the issue you're talking about?
I think if in community role didn't track to gender, yes. Because if role doesn't track to gender for a cis person, it doesn't track to gender for a non-binary person or a trans person. But one reason that I don't require beginners to learn both roles is that trans people in my communities only want to dance the role that defines their gender presentation. And that's something that felt very vulnerable around. So again, there's a lot of issues around that. I am interrupting. Do we have other thoughts to say to Sarah's question, or shall I go to the next one? Because I know we have more in the queue.
I do have a final thought on that, and that's I personally would rather not gender and dance roles conflate at all, but they do. And there's a performative aspect of gender and a performative aspect of dance roles. And one way that we can help tip the scales is having more masculine following and more feminine leading, right? That we can take these gender performance movement things and apply them to the dance and not necessarily to the bodies. And that's we could have a whole discussion about that, but I just want to throw that there.
Fantastic. All right. Next in my queue is Lexi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lexi. I use she, her pronouns. So nice to meet all of you. This has been such rich discussion. I am doing my master's currently, and my thesis is actually on gender-based violence in the Latin dance community and arts-based approaches to consent education. So this has been a really important conversation for me, and I kind of wanted to snap along to almost everything that's happening. So there are so many things that I could ask right now, but what I would pose is how Mark and Juliet and Fen, you feel that gender-based violence interacts with gendered roles in partner dance, and how the moving towards safer spaces and creating more opportunities for folks to dance in whatever role they choose can create opportunities for decreased instances of sexual harm.
Such an important question. I mean, I think there are so many ways in which they're linked, starting with the way the dances are structured, and to a certain extent the way they're taught, and they don't always have to be practiced this way, in that one role is controlling, choosing the movements and choosing the frame of where the touch is happening. And historically that role has been the man's role. And so I think if people are learning in these traditionally gendered roles, which a lot of people still are, men are learning this I get to control and choose mentality, and women are learning I've got to adapt my body and receive whatever comes at me and make it work to make the dance work. And so if we can train people so that they're experiencing both sides of that, I think they're going to have so much more empathy and incentive to try to negotiate that, trying to make sure their partner feels safe and comfortable. I have other thoughts, but Mark, you want to jump in, and Fen?
Yeah, I'm struggling to find a big nugget or a big thing, because they're all interlaced in a lot of different ways. But there's a light in my brain that's lighting up around isolation, and something about if we only have men dancing with women, and there's some lack of there's a kind of a boxing that happens, and whereas if we are all dancing with everyone, that those communications or those lines get more interspersed. That's the imperfect way. I don't know what's there, but that's the idea that I have that is lighting up for me.
Thank you. And I just want to mention, Mark, if you don't mind putting in the chat the article that you recommended, I would really appreciate it. You were mentioning about politeness. I would love to read it.
I was going to say, can we not pop it in the chat? Can we pop it in the Facebook group? And I'll handle doing that after today.
Okay, cool. I'm not.
And that way we can have links and it makes it accessible for folks, because rather than trying to get it out from Zoom.
Awesome. I'm not familiar with the Facebook group, but maybe the Facebook event, if you could help me out with that, Fen, I'd really appreciate it.
Let me pop it in the chat. The discussion continues online.
Thank you so much.
And while we sort that out, Samantha, you had a question for us.
So I have a quick statement / follow-up question, if that's cool. Because I know y'all were talking earlier about the importance of people asking, would you like to lead, follow, or switch when asking someone to dance? I know things that I've experienced in my communities is also we are encouraged in our lessons before we're set loose to enjoy the evening of dance to also not be afraid to say what we want and not just ask what other people want. So if a song is coming and we're like, I really want to follow to this song, you can like go up to someone and be like, would you like to lead me in this song? So I'm just hoping everyone here like knows we all have options, not just the people we're asking to dance, but we too can ask for what we need. So my follow-up question to that statement is, from what you all have observed in your scenes and from what you've heard, what else can you think of that you would like to see more of in the lessons?
Thank you for that statement, Samantha. I've been talking to students a lot recently about social conditioning, often for women to not ask for what they need. So I really appreciate asking that reminder. I would love to see more teaching about consent in the lessons, and it's something I've started doing, and it's so appreciative. I'm just like blown away that we haven't been doing this before because this, at least my students are so excited to talk about it. And I think it is related to the asking what role you want to do. I think they're just so intertwined, right? It's really asking about, let me tell you about the dance that I'm interested in right now. Here are some of the things that need to happen. And we do need to come up with quick codes so that it doesn't take the whole song to negotiate the dance that's about to happen. And so maybe that's what we can do more of as teachers and organizers. I know also, and fusion here, a lot of times it was normalized, lead, follower, switch. How are you comfortable with close embrace? Are you comfortable with lifts and dips? So there was like a series of 3 questions that people are asking each other. Yeah.
Right, and I want to, with those questions, or even with the like, do you want to lead, follow questions, with rapport and with like knowledge of a person, like building that relationship, those questions can be less needed, right? As you go through it. So you're dancing with someone, you always know that they want to lead you. Great, you don't need to have those conversations, right? Like, or you can do kind of quick checkups and read body language more than the verbal stuff. In terms of what I want to see more in the lessons, I just want to see more, like deeper more in all of the things, in terms of what the basics are, in terms of consent, in terms of like the switching and all of these. I want to get below that first bit. And in fusion, we struggle so much with it being such a broad dance. We hit everything so very slightly in our beginning lessons. And so my solution, or what I don't want to see more of, is series classes, or classes that expect people to go for longer. And I'm super jealous of both Fen and Juliet for teaching in academia, where they have captive audiences for a full season, kind of regardless. And yeah, so I want to see like more in depth there, so you can have an entire like 10-15-minute discussion around consent, instead of mentioning it as part of your last 5 minutes as you mention all of these cultural things, right? So just more and deeper is what I want to see.
All right, thank you to you both. I want to give people 2 minutes to decide if they want to drop their names in the chat and think of a question. I know I have a follow-up question from Daniel that I will get to if folks don't have fresh questions to offer. But before we do that, I just wanted to do a quick plug for next week. Because next week, this time, same Zoom address, we have Sydney Schiff and Ruby Rumbo, and they will be talking about training for dance. They're both highly steeped in kind of the nerdery of training. And we have Sydney in the room. Sydney, wave at me if you want to do a quick 2-minute thing about you do. All right, Sydney, tell us next 2 minutes. What are we going to get next week?
Sure. Hey guys. Wait, I'm outside. It's okay. So I'm coming at you from Chicago. I've been solo training, teaching online daily classes the entire pandemic, and I just started traveling and teaching again. I think it's been super important and definitely helped me improve as a dancer, training by myself, no social dancing at all. And I've gotten so much stronger, so much cleaner. I love that point that you made, Mark, about changing the styling, because that's everything I do. So now I'm teaching like solo training, styling for leads and follows. I teach the same class and everybody does the same footwork and the same rock out to whatever song they mention. And for me, that's everything. So the idea of being able to like come back in this time and not just say, okay, good, we like survived, but how do we continue that practice of training by ourselves? What do we do to make ourselves better partners? And how can this continue to be a part of our approach to being social dancers and achieving whatever goals we have now?
Thank you, Sydney. I'm really excited and looking forward to it. We have one question in the chat, and then I'm going to hop to Daniel. The question in the chat is, how do we balance, and this is from Dustin, how do we balance personal consent with norms we want to encourage? For example, how does consent interact with removing someone for not dancing with the same sex, I assume other people of the same sex in lessons?
That is such a good question. Because the standard historically in social dance is you circle around the room and everyone dances with everyone. And I certainly have been in environments where if somebody refuses to dance with somebody because of their sex, they are asked to not come back. As I'm having students practice asking each other to dance and negotiating how comfortable, because I just started touching in my class, and I have them ask each other, are you comfortable with touch today? Which body parts are you comfortable with touch today? Right? I think that we could, in a classroom setting, which is I think different from a dance, say that you do have the right to choose to not dance with somebody, but you need to explain it to me as the teacher why you're not dancing with that person. You don't have, so that if it's like I don't dance with men, then you say, okay, well, you're not welcome in this class. But if it's that person said something to me that made me feel uncomfortable because they were trying to get my phone number and I was creeped out, then I can also deal with it. So I think in a classroom, because there's a clear like power set up and somebody's in charge, this is different than a dance where there's still somebody in charge, but it's less of, they have less presence there. I think.
I'm going to interrupt for a second, Juliet, before we go to Mark, because I want to raise a cautionary point that multiple religions have rules, faith-based rules about not touching people of the opposite gender. And like I've had students in my classes who cannot dance with men. And they can only dance with women. I also wonder, because we're talking about gender, but what would you do to someone in class who simply said, I don't want to lead? I'm happy to dance with everyone in the room, but I only want to follow. And so like even these hard rules that we're talking about of like, if someone doesn't want to dance with other, like there's a lot, I think your point about explanation is really important, because rather than, if we start judging someone's intention, we could, you raised this point yourself, if we start applying white Western cultural values over the top of other things, we can run into problems really, really fast. And on that note, I will stand back, take off my moderator hat, and hand it
Well,
over
no,
to Mark.
that's the part of the point that I was wanting to make. So thank you for making that very eloquently. You went into religion in a way that I wasn't going to bring it into. I will bring it back into, again, homophobia a bit, and say that I think that there even is a place for someone to be uncomfortable dancing with other men in your classes, as long as that's something that they are like working on and that is not unsafe to other people, right? So I think that there's even a gray area there, and it could potentially even be a great place for them to work through some of that homophobia, as long as it's not coming at the expense of others. And that's a thing you'll have to figure out as an organizer. Like, where does that, if you're not, as this has said many, many times, the space is going to be unsafe for one person or the other, right? And if you don't do any like active moderation in that, it's likely going to be the person with the least power that's not going to be able to come back. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Fen, for those really key points. And that's certainly why I'm thinking that whoever's setting up the space, whether it's the teacher or the organizer, they can create the rules, which are, okay, this is the structure of the class. So let me know if this class is not going to work for you, or come talk to me about what we need to do to make it work for you.
Yeah. I am going to say in the chat that I have a rotation system that I'm going to post in the Facebook group, but I don't want to eat everyone's time. Daniel, is your question quick enough that we can do it very quickly? Because I want to at least put the question in the air.
I say, how about you go first?
Oh, I'm just going to type.
Oh, okay.
You can speak.
Yeah. I guess I had a number of questions, including like, well, I'm gonna have to pick one. But I found it really interesting what Mark said about adapting movements, because definitely as a primary male lead, one of the things that I've run into is like, when I'm looking for cues on how I should be dancing, right? I think that inherently my movements tend to be a little bit different than somebody with a different like set of body proportions. And like, for instance, in my aerial classes, that comes up, right? Like if I'm doing a hip balance, I'm going to do a hip balance differently because I've got a different distribution of where my weight is. And likewise, like, especially for dance, the movements that different bodies maybe look best with differ. And in a lot of ways, the movements that already exist are gendered. But the question that I was going to ask is a thing that we talked a lot about is gender and leading, and one that I'm curious what your views are on for both Mark and Juliet is gender and the question of who's actually doing the invitation to dance, right? Because Juliet, you mentioned that whoever does the invitation to dance generally is the lead in tango. So like there's a direct connection to that, and I found it interesting that we talked a lot about leading and following and about gender, but not as much about like where that locus of initiative is coming from, which I think is also a gendered thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it is. And I think in tango, the reason the community has, I think, accepted that is because whoever's initiating the movement has to choose, do I want to dance to this music? Because the music's so primary, because I have to construct the song. But I know like in swing, it's like super normalized for everyone to do the asking. Mark, do you have thoughts?
I'm consistently interrogating my thoughts on this, but I'm pretty old school in the like I still have old notions that in broad strokes, if you're asking someone to dance, you should at least be prepared to lead them. That if if the conversation goes, hey, would you like to dance? Yeah. Do you want to lead me? No. Okay, let's dance another song, right? Like, is it acceptable conversation? But yeah, I'm sharing that like that's kind of the norms that I'm carrying with me, or the values I guess that I'm carrying with me. I don't know if I'm gonna agree with them in 5 years from now, but that's something that I hold. I still think, again, I'll say this again, I think it's super important for men to ask other men to dance. And that locus of initiative is so important, whether they're leading or following, I suppose. Yeah.
Friends, this has been such a fantastic discussion. We are at time, and I want to honor the fact that Mark and Juliet are here giving their time and their expertise without compensation. And so my plan is to turn off the recording, and so we can all relax and breathe out and swear and shake and do those things. And then anyone is welcome to leave. If folks want to hang out and talk a little more, that is also welcome. But I'm officially putting Mark and Juliet off the clock. Can we please give them massive thanks for their time and the wisdom that they've just kind of shared with us today?
Thank you.